Language and the use of language is a really important part of the movie. And as a person who has spent his majority of his adult life learning and understanding and developing my use of language and like how it interacts with me and my world and how I like to write and present myself and communicate.
Do you speak Farsi?
I do not speak Farsi. No.
Oh, okay. Just was gonna check. So yeah, so let's talk about Arrival.
Before we even get started, I think it should go without saying to anyone who has an interest in the movie, hasn't seen it, we're going to get really into the weeds on spoilers. So if you have not seen it, please go check it out if you want to be a part of this discussion.
But you already opened this ostensibly in a tab to listen to this or downloaded it, so
Yeah.
why are you here?
Why are you even here? I really enjoyed this because, yeah, it's a movie about aliens, but to me, it's a movie about how no one knows how to talk to each other and how important talking to each other is. And we can kind of get into that here in a little bit, but especially with the year we've had so far this year, the climate, politically and socially and everything else that's going on in the world, just the importance of actually listening and talking to each other. I think it's kind of funny that it took a movie like this to kind of make me think about, how do people as a whole, how do we as a species actually communicate? And in the movie, it's presented in the context of we're talking to aliens, but that's, I don't know, we'll get into it in a little bit, but that's my takeaway from it that really kind of stuck with me, and I felt like it gave a good message for the time it was presented. I don't know if it was like intended to do so, if it just was really fortuitous timing, but
So overall thumbs up. Like it sounds
overall
like you're
thumbs up.
Giving a thumbs up.
Yeah, overall I really enjoyed it.
So I mean, and I'm glad that you kind of bring up that there's kind of a social context that surrounds this movie, because that's part of the thing that I kind of walked away from this movie, and I think that it's uniquely situated, and I also think that as a film, as far as when it was written, I think that it almost envisioned a different time in which we would now be living in. I think that I'm a little bit separate from you as far as my review of the film. And I want to soften that just a little bit by saying that I thought the cinematography was great. I thought that the acting was good. I mean, I'm not a particular fan of Adams or Renner. I mean, I've watched other movies that they've been in, but it was well done. And there's a lot of things that I really enjoyed about this movie. But I think that I came away from it a little bit different from you, and I think that you feel like the plot of the film spoke to you a little bit more, and I think that elements that you felt that you were connecting with for me were more of a disappointment. So maybe we can start at this point, kind of go through maybe just a couple of the basic arcs of the movie. I think that before we get into kind of the larger shell, I'd like to just kind of touch a little bit over things that we saw throughout the movie.
So for the real, for the people who don't want to go see the movie but are actually interested in what we have to say, should we give a quick overview of what actually happens in the movie?
Amy Adams' character, Louise Banks, is a linguist. She teaches probably at a Northeastern or Pacific Northwestern college. There's what appears to be a flashback that begins the movie, and you're kind of shown Banks interacting with her daughter, and you're shown a wedding ring on her finger, and then you ultimately are walked through her discovering that her child has cancer or some other kind of debilitating illness, and she loses her daughter. And the film ultimately picks up with Banks alone, just by herself. So what happens is you have a bunch of millennials who don't silence their phones in class one day as Banks is teaching about Portuguese, and there's a news report, and we find out that aliens have landed on Earth. Then, of course, military shows up on your doorstep when you're a really good scientist, and they start talking to Banks about...
But she's not a scientist, though.
Oh yeah, that actually we should. This is a funny aside, but we can talk about this, right?
Yeah.
There's that line where there's a flashback where her daughter's asking about homework or something, and she's like, how do I describe this term? And she gives an example, and her daughter's like, more sciencey than that, and Banks is like, ask your dad if you want more sciencey things. And I was like, okay, this movie doesn't consider linguistics a science. But yeah, so I mean, it's as far as like the run up and the setups. I think it's something that we've seen before. You have an expert being recruited by the government to help with a problem that they are not capable of solving by themselves.
Her expertise with language across the planet is there. We need somebody who can understand a language that we have no context for and help us learn it as quickly as possible, because there are now aliens here that we can't even see their mouths, we can't even talk to them or mimic the sounds they make, so we need to figure out how to communicate with them. And so they recruit her as the leading expert of language, I guess, and expect her to come and figure this out overnight.
Well, I don't know about overnight, but I don't know. There's just this. They play her some. I don't know. I feel like a friend on my Facebook feed described it the best. He's like they played her some whale sounds and was like, please translate this for us. you speak Farsi, please please help us with this. And you have this confused white dude just being like, hello, why are you here? What are your name? So, but I don't know. That's enough. What's Forrest Whitaker's character's name?
It's Colonel Weber.
Weber, okay. He plays hard to get and is like, we're not going to bring civilians to my secret camp in the mountains. But he finds out that that's a bad idea and wants to have her on the side anyways.
And then they bring her and she finds aliens and they talk to them and then everything else we're going to talk about. So where should we start?
The cinematography, like, I think that this film, like, maybe I sound super corny and just like unlearned when I say this, but establishing shots in this film, even if we're in an age where digital effects are everything, I just felt like it actually used the scale and the scope of displaying the presence of these aliens on the planet in their spaceship really well. The shell that hovers over these different spots is imposing and intimidating, and it really conveys that kind of mysterious, gets so smooth, It really reflects, as a viewer, as you're watching this and consuming it, you're like, I have no idea how this works. It resembles nothing like any other vehicle or technology that I'm familiar with. And that, I felt, was just really, like, it worked.
Well, and I don't know about you, but that first shot of it, as the camera pans over the Montana pasture and you see the cliffs or the mountains in the background and the clouds coming off and rolling off of it, but you just see this immense thing floating out there in such a serene, open setting, but there's still so much motion in the shot to kind of give you some context of depth and everything to add some scale to it. I thought that first shot was just incredible.
It's apprehension. You actually get this apprehension, and this whole point of the film, I think, is maybe where it's strongest. The film is strongest up in these early moments, where you really have this apprehension, and in the first couple moments where Ian, Renner's character is kind of getting suited up to like meet, to enter the shell for the first time, you have this tangible sense of just apprehension and just how foreign this object is and how imposing it is. I think it's easy to write off Renner's character as kind of being rather cliche, but that moment right before they're about to enter the shell and you have the shot of Ian's hand kind of brushing the bottom of the shell, and you can tell his character is just ecstatic. For me, I really felt like I connected with that character in that moment where I was just like, this person never thought they would see this. And that's a line that has been delivered in virtually every movie about first contact. It's the nerdy guy with his glasses falling off of his face, just being, I never thought that I would see the day that we would be visit, like blah, blah, blah. But no, it's like this movie really puts you into what that experience would be like. It didn't cheapen it through dialogue, actually, and it did it really effectively just through this. Renner's character just cannot believe that he's able to touch this thing. He's just excited about it. And then you contrast that with Adam's character, who's feeling claustrophobic already inside of her suit, but is looking at this massive shell, and she knows that she's going to be forced to go inside it. The contrast between the two of them, it just incredibly human. And then, I had kind of this chuckle. They're brought into the antechamber, and you start to see the shapes of the visitors for the first time, and then like Forrest Whitaker's character is like, okay, start, and I was like, what are you supposed to do? like how do you? But yeah, like just so much of that first scene, the whole gravity.
So before we get there, and this is kind of around that scene, and I just don't want to lose track of it because I think it's really impactful. Did you notice the amount of just they're not tracking shots. For the people who know more about film, pardon my ignorance, but they had a lot of those 2001 Space Odyssey shots where it's just a still camera, maybe with like a small zoom that tracks somebody entering a room or leaving a room. The first time I noticed it is when she first gets to the military camp and she's walking up towards the screen where you see all the different countries in the world that the U.S. is talking to who are all dealing with their own alien vessel floating above them. It just kind of is like an unbroken shot just trailing behind her where it's all fuzzy, and then you slowly realize, oh, there's Australia, there's China, there's Russia, there's Pakistan. To me as a viewer, it kind of gives you an extra sense of place, of realizing where she's at in her perspective of not understanding how big this actually is, and then, oh, wait, no, the whole world is here. The whole world's a part of this, and it kind of makes you as a viewer sit there and absorb everything with her in a way that I don't know if a lot of, I guess I'd say, modern movies really do that. I don't remember the last time I saw an unbroken shot like that for a while.
I've seen that this kind of technique be really intrusive, especially when it's kind of combined with like a shakiness, where the director intentionally decides that they're going to have a shakiness of motion behind the character. But this one was very smooth, and I felt like that shot didn't really feel like it took away. I don't know if I'm highlighting it the same way, but I felt like it was used appropriately.
The other time that I took a step back and noticed it is when you were talking about when they enter the vessel for the first time. It does this like awesome alien shot where it shows everybody in their spacesuits, right, with their flashlights going down like a dark hallway, as it kind of just zooms back down the hallway and just shows them moving slowly as you realize how big everything is and how different it is. And then that's, where the gravity stuff comes into play, and you realize, oh, the people in the background, they are not in the same perspective that they're at. I loved how when they enter the spaceship to learn, there's like a literal, you have to change your point of view to even get here moment, like when they jump into the different gravity or whatever. I really enjoyed that as a touch of the movie, for them to for you to even learn something new here. You need to change the way that you look at your reality. You need to change the way you look at the world.
And we're going to turn things upside down.
Yeah. And like that's just kind of compounded for the next shot where they walk in, and the shot where they walk up to the screen for the first time, the camera's upside down.
Just like it doesn't matter. I mean, I got the impression that gravity was just attached, or being emanated off of each wall. It doesn't really matter, but it's kind of like, it really kind of gave you, on the part of me thinks that it's heavy-handed, but on the other it's like these are nice elements that kind of make it cohesive, that they're reinforcing elements. And you can tell that there's a lot of attention that's been put into just establishing what it's like to be inside the shell, to make contact. All of that was very, very strong, and I really like some of these subtle things, but they bring like a bird in with them, the canary in the coal mine. It's a very symbolic thing, but but at the same time I kind of was like, I kind of like this, I'm glad that it's not some other technology. The sound, you hear this little bird rustling around and chirping in this big room, you can tell how they're in this cave. And so I don't know, I just felt like it was that kind of thing. It could seem kind of corny, but at the same time, this feels appropriate and gives you a sense of how large this space is, and what it's like to actually trying to communicate with these beings that are emerging out of this mist and the other across the wall.
Well, I love how the bird is just instantly recognizable of what its purpose is too.
Yeah.
They never even bother to even mention the bird outright. It's just there.
It didn't feel cliche though, and there's so much kind of assumption about what these beings represent. So the fact that they've got this canary to take with us into the mine, to know that something bad is happening, it shows so many assumptions that humanity has about going in and experiencing something new. And so it felt like it was a strong symbolic clue into how humanity approaches these types of problems.
It's kind of humbling, right?
Yeah, it really kind of puts you, like the viewer, in your place as far as how we face problems. And maybe ultimately that's kind of a really fairly smug thing to do as far as a writing trick, but I don't know, I felt like it worked.
Yeah. It's like, hey, these beings have traveled across space and time, and the best thing that we have to tell us how safe we are is still a canary.
But also it's just the assumption is these things are here to hurt us or do something bad. But the first contact scene, even though it's very short, It's very nice because it sets up the core problem. You've got some exposition that brings Banks that ultimately puts her into the setting, but this scene is key as it sets up the whole problem, which is how do you communicate with something that doesn't appear to have a mouth. One of the things that annoyed me in this film was they don't appear to have eyes, so how do they how can they read writing and all of this other stuff? And that's the main problem, is that you're separated from these things and they don't appear to speak in words. So how do you start to do this? And so that kind of ties into Banks ultimately coming to the center of this question. You have a couple moments when they're back in the base camp, they're shut out of the shell. You get kind of clues about what the rest of the world is trying to do to tackle this problem. And I think my favorite moment was the Australian. He's just we've been playing their sounds back to them. And so the guy talking to him is well, what did they do? And he's well, they played our sounds back to us. And I was yeah, this is totally what we should be doing. I was I don't know, maybe that was meant to be a joke, but I was just holy. Adam's character ultimately is cutting through all of that, the heart of this problem, and realizes that you can't vocalize language, but maybe there's some other method of doing so. And so it leads us into kind of the nature of language itself. And I think that there's two things that we maybe want to talk about. Nick, you're picking up on kind of the thematic importance of the language, but for me, I'm kind of more thinking about it as, I definitely started looking at this from kind of an internal consistency. I think we should talk about both, but for me, the main thing about this movie that drew me was the premise of the problem. I was literally interested in, I wanted to see how do you even go about talking to something, and it became pretty clear to me, about midway through the movie that wasn't what was really the centerpiece of this film. It was kind of just a vehicle for something else, but I was still paying attention to that. For me, I thought that the centrality of this film would be about solving the problem of communicating with these beings based off the limited understandings that we have. And I felt like that is very much in the tradition of, many sci-fi movies. But in most films about first contact, there's almost this, already kind of in place. Either the aliens already know how to speak our language because they've observed us or some other reason, or they communicate with us through something that's not even language, telepathically or something like that. Most other films about first contact are really just dealing with kind of the viscerality of seeing something and experiencing something that's foreign. But this film, I think, posed a very unique question, which is, how do you talk to these other beings? And I really thought that the core of this film would be about that, but it actually turned into something else. And the way that you start to understand this is through what appear to be these cuts, these different sequences that Adam's character is seeing, where she's suddenly in a different place where she's speaking with her daughter. What appear to be flashbacks, but are actually, not even flash forwards. They're not flashbacks. They're not flash forwards. They just are.
So you kind of touched on something, and I want to pick your brain about it a little bit more. You said something to the effect of, you were disappointed that this didn't develop that idea of communicating for first contact specifically a little bit better because it didn't fit into your idea of how sci-fi has kind of approached a topic like this in the past. I guess my question for you is to me, when I think of sci-fi like this, it usually is taking a big concept like this and using some extreme circumstance to break it down a little bit for its audience. To me, this kind of fit right into that little realm of classic science fiction. The bigger point was always something else in the background. The alien conversation was just a vessel to kind of get to start thinking about the other point of the story.
The reason why I'm disappointed is because the story that this film ultimately, I feel, is trying to tell is not really... The idea of first contact is kind of secondary to what the rest of the film is about. And I think that it's interesting and fun fiction for a human problem to, maybe this is the story of all stories, really, is that a human problem is central to an event that's happening around us. And so I think that is, that's not really a complaint, but that's what this story is. But ultimately, there's a larger kind of meta question, which is, if you see and understand the totality of your existence, what kind of implication does that have for how you live your life? I felt like that was kind of a waste of this wonderful question that seemed to be posed by the trailers, which is language and communicating with something foreign. But as far as the problems and challenges that we face today in our real world, I feel like we are foreign to each other, and we're not really speaking the language of each other. And so I feel like this film maybe wasted some of its potential in that sense. And it wastes it is because it ultimately brings in this dimension, this other kind of interesting idea, merely in service of the reveal of the film, I think. So this kind of non-linearity of time. I feel like this film ultimately suffers from a deus ex machina. Like this film's principal conflict was not kind of resolved by elements within the film. It was resolved kind of by a fairly magical process. And to me, that feels disappointing in the face of like science fiction. Maybe you didn't catch this. There's a moment where I think Ian talks to Luis, and he says, do you feel like you're dreaming in their language or something like that? To me, I'm not really sure how you do that. It's a bunch of circles. I don't know how you would vocalize. I just had no idea what that really meant. Luis brings up very much in passing this idea, this like Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This is the notion that I don't think is in as much favor these days. It's the notion that kind of structures of a language have at least some kind of influence on the culture that ultimately springs up around the people who develop the language, and that it also has implications for how a person sees and experiences the world. But that's where this film kind of meets its kind of justification for its plot, that learning a language is hugely impactful for how you experience the world around you, I guess. And it ultimately leads into how the film is resolved through what, I feel like it is impossible to conceive of it as anything other than a paradox. I felt like the drama, the intensity of everything building up to it was exciting. I was sitting in my seat, I enjoyed it, but I knew that I was going to stick on it, and I was like, God, like this is how they're choosing to resolve this. It's not out of something. It's literally out of magic. Like there's some form of magic.
Well, because you're viewing time too linearly, Andrew.
Because the way that I think about this, if time exists as like it's unidirectional, right? If we agree that time is time unidirectional, you can't go back in time, right? But I mean, that's what this film ultimately does. Like it's saying that learning this language makes it possible for you to travel backwards in time, not just like experience everything else. It's just like you can now travel through time by knowing how to make super awesome looking circles.
It's not, but they're not time traveling though. Like it's omniscience, right?
I don't think it's omniscience, because the issue is this loop had to start at some point, right? Time should probably be conceived as like the past is closed but the future is open. Like there's like multiple directions that the future can take, but the past is ultimately written. You can't really pull things backwards. And so I think that like that's fine, but and like even this idea of non-linearity of time makes sense, but time is flowing in a single direction. It doesn't really matter if it's linear or if it's expanding in every direction simultaneously, right? But your awareness is just your existence as like a mortal being that is not able to transcend time but experiences it. Like even if you could hypothetically understand every single point of awareness, you'd just be seeing each slice simultaneously. Like that's what I feel like this would have to work if this is truly what their language is capable of, and it's not just like magic, but instead the language is magic.
I understand what you're saying. I don't agree with it, but I get why it's disappointing to you. I understand what you're saying, and like I don't know, for me narratively it didn't seem like it bothered me that much, but like to me, to me, the time travel wasn't really the point of the movie.
Yeah,
right.
And that's something that I understand. This movie wasn't, it's not meant to talk about time travel. It's meant to communicate something more. And so I think like for that reason, you're probably in a better place to experience and talk about the themes of this movie.
So there's a bunch of moments in the movie that kind of jump out to me where it's not related to the plot of the communication with the aliens, but it's just it stumbles into communication in other ways that I think are pretty important. And that's kind of where I said, like, I think the point of the movie is that people just don't know how to talk to each other. And I think my favorite embodiment of this is the CIA director guy,
Right.
who's hanging out with them in the, throughout everything. He's the guy talking to Langley. He's the guy telling us what the Chinese are doing and everything. And he's such a Debbie Downer the entire movie.
Right.
They say anything to him and he hears the worst possible outcome.
Right.
Like they're trying to explain to Ian how the air circulates through the spaceship or how their assumption works. And he's just like, well, that doesn't make any sense to me. Why wouldn't you do that? And he said, oh, well, if they're moving the atmosphere, it must be because it takes so long to actually pump out the atmosphere. They're not just trying to put oxygen in the room. They're trying to recalibrate it for Earth's atmosphere so we can be okay. And all the Langley guy hears is so they can suffocate us is what you're telling me. and that's not what is being said. I guess it's a side effect of what, is being what he's being informed, but it's not actually like the point of what he's saying, but it's enough information that he hears what he needs to hear. And there's, that kind of continues throughout the movie when they find out, when the aliens inform them that we want to share the weapon, he automatically jumps to the worst possible conclusion because that's what the army jumps to. And there's just this theme throughout the movie of what's being heard and what's being said are not the same thing. And it's kind of like this constant struggle for Louise to try to explain to the people who don't want to hear what she's saying what they need to know. And they kind of hit the nail on the head. Like, I guess they really rub the audience's face in it when they start talking about how the aliens' language works. And the way their language works, it doesn't convey sound, it conveys meaning, which is kind of like a throwaway line, except for they kind of include Louise explaining to Colonel Weber the entire time that they need to see me. I need to be there to see them. There's more to language than just, what is being said. There's all these other aspects to it. And so, like, to me, the combination of those two, the first thing it made me think of is they're trying to inform me as an audience member that the way I communicate and talk is deeper than just like the words that I'm saying, but it all carries a message which can get lost and confused.
The word that I would use to describe what you're talking about is that there's mistrust. Often that is carried within communicating with someone that you're not familiar with. Mm-hmm. And that is actually something that is persistent, through just how humans interact with each other. And that kind of mistrust is a barrier for so much of the things that we do. Banks is ultimately designed to be a force rejecting that kind of lack of trust. But again, like, this isn't even just like a problem with like the technicality, is like, I'm not really sure like how her resolution ultimately resolves that kind of question that's being posed of, if you're stuck with this level of mistrust, like, how do you resolve it? Like, I almost felt like that was another thing that I was dissatisfied with. I was like, you didn't really answer this fundamental problem that you've set up, which is that humans have this kind of a lot of mistrust amongst each other for various reasons. And the aliens, their contact, their visit upon the Earth is ultimately even just they become like, we approach them as the same type of problem that we approach everything else. And I just feel like even the way that the film like wrote itself out to like end it didn't really answer that kind of existential question. So I don't know.
You don't think it did?
Yeah, how do you feel like the resolution of the film ultimately tidied that up? How do I carry that back out into the real world? If I'm trying to understand someone, the implication that I have is I need to learn a new language, but I also need to just have a really, really super precise knowledge about someone so that they have to trust me. And but to me, I'm just like, how do I do that if I don't necessarily know them in the first place? And how do I access that kind of like omnipresent knowledge?
I think what they're trying to get at is that knowledge can break down these communication barriers. The more that you know, the more that you like educate yourself, the clearer that communication can be, right? Like that's why the aliens in the movie break up their total sum into 12 parts, because to them, to get the secret, you all need to talk to each other. You all need to share this with each other. And to me, that's kind of where the omniscience from seeing, your past and your future by learning the language comes into play, is because only once she's able to learn more information from, her future decisions is she able to inform her decision making and her communication in the past. To me, the greater message is knowledge is shared, and that helps break down these communication barriers, because ignorance is the thing that kind of locks us out of everything else.
I don't really feel like it used a lot of its elements to convey that in a smooth way. It actually did it in kind of a very unsubtle way and did it through some montages. It's like, well, the general's calling a press conference and everything's going to be okay now.
So a counter to that, I think that the climactic build for the movie was, to me, when the aliens say, share weapon, and the entire world goes on a blackout, right? Like there's some slight misinformation or some slight miscommunication. It scares everybody, and our response is, like you said, it's all about, protecting what you know and being safe. Everyone's gut reactions to turn off the monitors. We're done talking to Russia and China and Australia and Britain. Like, they're going dark. It's every man for himself now. This knowledge is ours, and we're going to figure it out. And now the job is to do it before other people do, because they're all going to get a weapon. And so, to me, I feel like that's a pretty effective use of this narrative point of ignorance can lead to panic. It can lead to fear. And the best way to clarify is like what Amy Adams says. We need to go back in there and talk to them about this. We're using words that we don't understand, that they don't understand, and it's confusing everything, and it's making it harder to deal with. And, the CIA guy's reaction is no, they're trying to turn on us, because the most obvious answer is fight amongst ourselves until one person's left.
Right. And you have other things that reinforce that. You have the soldier that ultimately sets a bomb inside the chamber. You have all these elements that definitely set up that to be the ultimate message, which is that, we mistrust each other, and that the things that we misunderstand lead us to make decisions that are ultimately counter to what our collective interest is. I don't feel like this movie is isolated, and I feel like this movie is actually successful for a lot of the things that it does, but I feel like it's not isolated in that it lives in this species of large movies that have a tremendous amount of work that's done on the concepting and the world building and kind of the development of early concepts, but it's almost like I feel like I watch some of these movies, I can see where people had written a bunch of stuff on a whiteboard, and then they were just like, well, we're not really sure how to tidy all of this up, but let's just give it to, Jimmy and Erica, and they'll draft this out, and we'll worry about it then, I almost feel like I can see some of that when I'm seeing the conclusions of these films, or kind of the ultimate resolution, because so much of these films seems very much built on kind of selling me in the first hour or 30 minutes of the film to get me to be okay, I know where I am, I know who these people are, good. And then the actual plot structure is a little bit more ham-fisted than the sophistication that's shown in developing the world.
So I guess I kind of want to talk through this. What do you think the point of omniscience is in the context of the plot? Based off what you said, I feel like that's probably your biggest point of contention, is this magical thing happens and suddenly it changes everything, right? So I guess I kind of want us to dig into why isn't it even in the plot anyway? What does it add to the narrative that makes it important?
The reason why I kind of will drop this and just let it be is that, to me, this movie isn't really about the aliens, it's about the reveal. We realize, the things that we saw in the first couple seconds of the movie were actually the past, but the past is not really important. And my favorite line in the movie, my favorite sequence in the movie, is right at the end when Banks asks Ian, if you could see everything in your life, would you do anything differently? And Ian says, the only thing that I would do different is I'd probably speak my mind more often. And to me, I felt like that was what this movie was about. It's about that kind of human relationship between Ian and Luis. And I felt like I liked the two of them as characters. That to me was the core message that I kind of walked out of the theater with, and I took away was, what do you do with that kind of power? And so there's a lot of other things that's inside this movie, kind of these thematic questions about communication, mistrust, dealing with something that's foreign. But ultimately, this film was about the two of them. And to me, like, I felt like there were a lot of little things that were going on in this movie. You have like these flash forwards that are happening in the background, and it's being linked to the fact that she's learning their language. And so all of that ultimately ties to this kind of question of like human determinism and mortality. You can see how everything plays out in your life. So what do you do with that information? And how do you live if you suddenly had the full range of your memory? I felt like that was an interesting kind of question, an interesting kind of like thing to think about. And that's why I really like that line from Ian, who doesn't, he's not experiencing that the full range of like that moment, and the conflict that they ultimately that he has that causes their divorce. That it makes that interesting to me, but it's like I don't know if you needed the aliens to tell that story and to like make that an interesting question.
To me, it, like I said, I feel like as a whole, and I said this before, the point of the movie is kind of making people think about how they talk to each other. And so to me, like, the magic power is, and we kind of touched on it before, is knowledge, right? So I guess, how do you talk to people who don't know as much as you do? How do you interact with the world around you when they don't have as much knowledge and understanding as you have? I think a really neat point in the movie is that, and I don't know if I talked to you about this before we start talking or not, did you realize when you first saw the movie that the aliens knew English the whole time?
No. What's your justification
so
for this?
If the point of the alien language is that it changes your perception of time, so you know everything that has happened in your life and that's going to happen in your life, why wouldn't the aliens know English when they first get there? Because they see their entire timeline as a flat circle, right? That loops back around. So the knowledge the aliens had at the end of their interactions with Ian and Louise is with them when they first get there.
Yeah, but it's just like I just metaphysically I just don't know how that works.
Well, but it's the caveat of the special power of the time travel knowledge or whatever in the movie. Like what they know is what they've always known, and they know enough at the end of the movie that when Louise is talking to them in the chamber, they know how to communicate with her. They know enough English with her at that point in time to talk to her directly, which means that they always understood what English was. The point I'm getting at here is the aliens had to train humans to get to the point where they could talk to them. The movie's not about them learning how to talk to people. The movie's about like helping the people get to the point where they can have a conversation with them, right?
That's like a very like almost like a very zen thing. At the same time, I'm just like I'm really like I'm thrown all over.
You gotta let it go.
I can't.
The science. The whole point of it is that like the science is like just the caveat you give them to get the point across, right? So if the magic power is the thing that's bugging you gotta let it go, because the point of the movie behind it, you're not gonna get to that if you just don't let it go, Andrew.
I just feel like it's a tenuous thread. Like sometimes, like it like I'm given some, like I'm already kind of like out on a limb where I'm just like, there are aliens, and I'm like, I'm in this universe where I can think that these things exist, and it's just like sometimes you're being given too much, too many things to swallow, and it's I don't know, like I just felt like the justification was very strange, and like looping it in a like pseudoscience-y explanation, the Sapir-Whorf thing, I was just like, what? Like I don't know, but I liked the question that kind of gets posed at the end, between Renner and Adam's characters as they're kind of concluding. It's just like that's an interesting question, and that it's a question of mortality. It's the question that this film was talking about is mortality and kind of the totality of your existence, and how do you deal with that? I feel like, but there's just so many other things in this film, and that's why I feel like I have the whiteboard effect, where I'm just, somebody put like 3 word, they were word bubbling, and like there were 3 of them, and they were like, okay, well, how do we get all of these things to connect? And I'm just like, I wish that they just picked one, I guess.
I know. I just think of the part in the movie where they're like doing the montage where they're talking about how they're like learning to talk to the aliens, and it's like Ian walks and he's walking across like, in front of the screen between the aliens, and the aliens having full knowledge of everything are like, you stupid I know what you're doing, and just like walking along just to humor him.
The implication of like all of this is just like, it's just like the Abbott alien is just like, well, gonna die, like, like, I don't know. The implication of that is mostly just like, wow, like, we are assholes to Abbott. Like,
what I think's really funny is that last time that they go to meet with them, I might be wrong. I was trying to keep track of the names, so I might have confused them.
Mm-hmm.
But before the bomb goes off, one of the aliens like takes its time to get to the window. And I noticed that the second time I watched the movie, and I was like, wait, is the one that doesn't want to walk up to the window the one that knows he's about to die?
No. Well, I don't know. I'd have to look for that, but I do like how the other one just like flies away, and I was like, oh, like he knows. All right. Well, I feel like we've put this one to bed.
Yeah. It's usually when I walk out of movies like this, I feel like I've gotten everything out of it that I've wanted, and I don't really ever need to watch it again. Like I'm pretty notorious for once I'm done with a movie, I'm done with it, and I never go back to it. And I know I feel like there's a lot of subtle stuff in this movie that I'll keep picking up on. I'll probably watch it again in the future just to kind of see what else it has. Apparently, it's based off a short story, so I might be interested to go check that out, see what the short story's about.
I might read that. I don't think I'll watch the film again, not for a long time. Like, I wanted this movie to be one that I could kind of play with and puzzle over, but kind of the same way that its story is. It seems like it's kind of deterministic and only reaching towards one place. So
see, you viewed this movie as a scientist. I viewed it as a poet. That's why I loved it and you hated it.
That's fair.